Welcome to Infinite Business Dynamics. In today's video, we're going to build a strong foundation in modern Kanban for PMP success. This is not simply about learning how to use a Kanban board. We're going to understand the thinking behind Kanban, how it manages work, controls work in progress, improves flow, and helps teams respond to delivery challenges. We'll also connect these concepts directly to the PMP exam, particularly the kind of situational thinking required when dealing with capacity, constraints, uncertainty, prioritization, and adaptive or hybrid delivery.
Modern Kanban, defining the framework.
So what exactly is modern Kanban? Well, it's best understood as a method for managing and improving the delivery of knowledge work and services. It's really about moving work smoothly from a backlog right into progress and ultimately delivering value. This aligns perfectly with the adaptive, agile mindset you absolutely need for the exam. Remember, it's not just about listing tasks. It is about truly mastering flow and pull systems. Now, we need to dispel a major myth right off the bat. A visualization board covered in chaotic sticky notes, that does not constitute Kanban. True modern Kanban is a robust management method. It requires a configured system. We're talking a combination of workflow, explicit policies, work-in-progress limits, metrics, and cadences. Solving unpredictable delivery, the problem arc. Kanban specifically cures unpredictable delivery. In knowledge work, we constantly suffer from a lack of visibility, right? Work gets hidden or scattered, we take on way too much work in progress, which creates massive delays, and priorities get completely blurry. Well, Kanban targets those exact issues. It literally turns hidden work into visibility, and it transforms chaotic variability into a predictable, smooth flow. Section method, factory to knowledge work. To really grasp this, we need to look back at the history. We start with Toyota's physical signaling mechanism in the 1950s, which was built for just-in-time production. Fast forward to the 1990s, and lean thinking enters the scene, bringing a heavy focus on value and eliminating waste. Then, by 2004, pioneers like David J. Anderson adapted these concepts specifically for software and IT at Microsoft. And finally, we arrive at today, a distinct management method utilizing visualization and flow control, specifically tailored for knowledge work. The absolutely crucial takeaway from this evolution is this. While modern Kanban was heavily inspired by Toyota's pull concepts, it is definitely not just a factory system blindly transplanted onto a project board. No way. It's a sophisticated evolutionary management approach designed from the ground up for knowledge workers like us. Core principles and logic, the rules of flow. Okay, we have got to break down the critical distinction between principles and practices. The change management principles, they tell us to start exactly where we are right now. Pursue evolutionary, incremental change, and encourage acts of leadership at literally all levels of the organization. Conversely, the core practices are what actually dictate daily operations. That means visualizing the workflow, limiting your work in progress, managing flow, making policies explicit, implementing feedback loops, and improving collaboratively. So, how does this build into an operational logic? The sequence here is incredibly vital for the PMP exam. First, make work visible. Why? Because that allows you to control your work in progress, which then naturally exposes underlying systemic problems. You then learn from that feedback to improve the system, which ultimately allows you to deliver value predictably. You're not just telling people to work harder, you are systematically exposing constraints and fixing the system itself. It's a real game changer. Anatomy of Kanban systems, essential vocabulary. Let's think of the Kanban system as a whole, the whole shebang. The board, the workflow, the items, the policies, and the metrics, all working together in harmony. The workflow is the actual sequence of activities from a request all the way to delivery. And you'll notice WIP limits restricting the amount of work in any specific stage, alongside explicit policies and classes of service. Those classes dictate treatment categories based on urgency, risk, or value. Let's isolate explicit policies for a second. These are the agreed-upon rules governing exactly how work enters, moves through, and exits the system. They make the system entirely transparent to everyone on the team. After all, if the rules are invisible, the process simply cannot be improved, right? These policies provide a rock-solid, transparent baseline for continuous improvement. Now, another critical metric you need to know is work item age. This tracks exactly how long an unfinished work item has been in progress. Tracking this is huge because it allows project managers to proactively identify aging work before it gets permanently stuck in the mud. If an item is getting unusually old, that's a glaring signal to the team to jump in, intervene, and clear out the blockage. Mastering WIP and flow, the capacity paradox. I always like to think about the WIP limit paradox like a highway. If you have 100% utilization, you have 0% flow. It's just a massive traffic jam. When too much work is started, context switching shoots up, queues grow, and predictability basically dies. But if you optimize capacity, you actually maximize throughput. Limiting work in progress prevents system overload. It all comes back to the core Kanban mantra: stop starting and start finishing. Let's contrast push versus pull systems. A push system shoves work downstream regardless of capacity, completely ignoring limits and building disastrous queues. That just leads to longer lead times and constant rework. True Kanban, on the other hand, uses a pull system. Work is started only when the next step has the real capacity, the actual space, to accept it. This respects capacity, controls your WIP, minimizes queues, and creates a beautifully smooth, predictable flow. Okay, pay close attention here because we need to clarify a critical PMP exam distinction that trips up so many candidates. What is the difference between a bottleneck and blocked work? Well, a bottleneck is a systemic capacity restriction that consistently constrains throughput. Think of a specific testing phase that always backs up. Blocked work, however, is just a specific item that cannot proceed right now. Maybe you are missing a vendor signature. A blocked item is a mere observation of a single task, whereas a bottleneck is a systemic flow constraint that demands continuous improvement. And here is another crucial exam trap to watch out for: WIP versus backlog. WIP, or work in progress, is work that has started but is not yet finished. The backlog, though, is work identified but not started. So items waiting in the backlog do not count against your active work in progress limits. Only the active, in-process work is actually considered WIP. Let's apply all of this with a complex PMP scenario. Imagine a team proposes changing the workflow because delivery is incredibly slow. Do you immediately implement the change across the board, or do you treat it as a systemic experiment? Using Kanban thinking, you don't just mandate a big bang change based on a hunch. Instead, you treat it as an evolutionary experiment. You define what improvement actually means, make a small change, observe the evidence, and evolve from there. So how exactly do we measure the success of that systemic experiment? To conquer these exact scenario traps on the exam, you are going to need flow efficiency metrics, cumulative flow diagrams, and service level expectations. We will be deconstructing all of those advanced flow analytics in part 2 of this explainer. See you there. Kanban and Agile methodologies breakdown part 2. We're totally bypassing the basics today and getting straight into the actual mechanics of diagnosis and flow. Look, if you're going to fix a broken system, you've got to pinpoint the exact point of failure using precise data and solid methodology. Let's get right into it. Section 1, Core Definitions and Metrics. Mixing these two concepts up? It's a common lexicon traps. First up, backlog is not WIP. A backlog is just identified work that hasn't actually started yet. WIP, or work in progress, is work actively in progress. Simply put, a waiting item sitting in a queue, not WIP. Second trap, busy does not equal flowing. A traditional productivity mindset asks, hey, how busy is everyone? But a true flow mindset asks a much better question. How effectively is work actually moving from demand to delivery? And finally, we've got to let go of guaranteed rigid deadlines. In the real world, we use a service level expectation, or SLE. Notice that probability curve? An SLE is a probabilistic expectation based on your actual historical capability. It's like saying, hey, we're 85% likely to complete this in 10 days, rather than just making a blind promise. When you're measuring this flow, the absolute most vital lesson, literally write this down, is to always ask from what exact event to what exact event. Lead time usually measures the elapsed time from the initial request or commitment all the way to final delivery. And yeah, that includes waiting periods. Cycle time, however, is a lot narrower. That's the elapsed time a work item spends actively moving through a defined active portion of your delivery process. Your measurement boundaries absolutely must be explicitly specified, or honestly, your data is totally useless. Okay, these 6 interconnected metrics act as your system's vital signs. Think of it as your dashboard of flow. Throughput is the number of work items completed per unit of time. Remember, it's a flow measure, not an individual productivity measure. Work item age tells you exactly how long an unfinished item has been sitting around in the system. The cumulative flow diagram, or CFD, is that area chart showing the accumulation and movement of work. It is hands down your best indicator of workflow stability. Then we've got flow efficiency, which reveals those hidden delays by comparing active work time to total elapsed time. Classes of service give you explicit treatment policies based on value or risk, so you actually know how to handle an expedite versus a standard item. And wrapping it up, the SLE provides that probabilistic delivery expectation based on your actual historical capability. Moving right along to Section 2, the Kanban overlay. Let's look at the fundamental shifts across delivery approaches here. On the left, the predictive column is plan-driven. It's sequenced, it has a fixed schedule, and it's always asking, are we executing the plan? Scrum, right there in the middle, is iterative. It uses fixed-length sprints, controls WIP indirectives by managing sprint scope, and asks what increment can we deliver this sprint. But then look at the Kanban column. It is entirely flow-oriented. The work structure is continuous flow. Commitment? That's a pull system based on actual available capacity. WIP control is explicit through strict, hard WIP limits. The cadence is totally context-dependent, and there are no mandatory prescribed roles. Its ultimate core question is simply, how can we improve the flow of work? I absolutely love this next concept. Kanban is not a replacement framework. You don't install it by ripping out Scrum or your predictive model. It is an evolutionary engine. Imagine it as a transparent lens placed directly over your existing, messy process. You do not need to tear down current roles or workflows to get started. You just use visualization and WIP limits to force those systemic constraints right up to the surface. And once they become visible through the lens, you resolve them through small, continuous, highly collaborative experiments. It's evolutionary change, not a revolutionary teardown. All right, time for Section 3, PMP exam heuristics. If you are navigating complex situational questions on the exam, these heuristics are going to absolutely save you. We're going to break it down into the situation, the trap, and the Kanban thinking. First up, managing capacity. The situation. Delivery is grinding to a halt because team members are working on multiple items simultaneously. The trap here is thinking you just need to add more people to increase bandwidth. No way. The Kanban thinking? Examine your current WIP and introduce explicit WIP limits to force items to actual completion. Stop starting, start finishing. Next, situation. Resource utilization is at 100%. Everyone is sweating, incredibly busy, yet customer delivery times just keep increasing. The trap is assuming high utilization automatically equals better performance. The Kanban thinking shifts focus entirely away from worker utilization and onto system flow. You've got to examine the queues, your active WIP, and find those systemic bottlenecks. Moving on to blockages and pressure. This situation. Items are totally stuck waiting on regulatory approval. The trap is assigning fresh new work to the team just so they stay busy while they wait. The Kanban thinking says absolutely not. You need to visualize the blocked work explicitly and investigate the systemic constraint causing the delay in the first place. Another super common situation. A powerful sponsor demands the team start 5 new requests immediately to prove they are responsive. The trap is starting all 5 just to appease them. The Kanban thinking requires you to evaluate current capacity against your WIP limits, clearly explain your explicit pull policies to the sponsor, and defer starting until capacity actually opens up. You have to protect the flow. Now let's look at transformation, the situation. Management wants to discard the whole workflow and impose a radical new agile process overnight. The trap is executing this massive Big Bang process replacement. The Kanban thinking dictates that you start exactly with what you do now, visualize it, and pursue incremental, evidence-based evolutionary change. No sudden moves. And how about this situation? Management criticizes a specialist team because they occasionally have a little idle time during a sprint. The trap is increasing WIP limits just to keep everyone fully utilized at all times. The Kanban thinking requires you to defend the flow. You have to explain that 100% individual utilization actually harms overall system predictability. You must optimize for system flow, not individual busyness. Let's tackle predictability. The situation. Anxious stakeholders are demanding a guaranteed rock-solid delivery date for a complex feature. The trap is promising a fixed date without analyzing any system data. The Kanban thinking uses historical lead time data to establish that service level expectation, or SLE, we talked about earlier. Give them probabilities, not empty promises. And for prioritization, the situation, urgent requests repeatedly interrupt ongoing work, creating absolute chaos. The trap is treating every single new request as an automatic drop-everything emergency. The Kanban thinking says you must enforce explicit policies. Examine your classes of service. Is this truly an expedite item or just a standard one?
and thoroughly analyze the cost of delay before you ever even think about breaching a WIP limit.
Our final heuristics cover improvement and hybridization. The situation: a team proposes changing a fundamental workflow step because they think it will go faster. The trap is implementing it permanently just because a manager kind of likes the idea. The Kanban thinking treats that proposal as a hypothesis. You collect baseline data, run the change as a controlled experiment, and then evaluate the hard evidence. And finally, the situation: a Scrum team suffers from excessive WIP, and items are constantly spilling over unfinished at the end of sprints. The trap is concluding that Scrum has completely failed and abandoning it entirely for Kanban. The Kanban thinking creates a hybrid approach. You apply Kanban practices, like visualization, explicit WIP limits, and flow management, directly inside the existing Scrum framework to stabilize delivery.
And that brings us to Section 4, Hybrid Agility and Conclusion. To build our final baseline, we really need to clear the ledger of any remaining misconceptions out there. First off, Kanban is not just a board. The board is merely the visualization. Kanban itself is the actual management method. It doesn't mean no planning. It simply changes how work is replenished and pulled. And crucially, it absolutely has limits. Explicit WIP limitation is a core practice. It doesn't require daily stand-ups. Your cadences are context-dependent, not fixed. It doesn't prescribe roles like product owners either. More WIP definitely does not mean more productivity. In fact, overloading destroys your flow. Also, blocked is just an item state, whereas a bottleneck is a systemic constraint. And finally, while it was heavily inspired by Toyota's just-in-time manufacturing, modern Kanban has been deeply adapted specifically from modern knowledge work. Now, this intersection right here, this is where the magic happens. When you have a situation where a Scrum framework is really struggling, excessive WIP, unfinished items constantly spilling over at the end of the sprint, the exam trap, and honestly the real-world trap, is assuming Scrum and Kanban are mutually exclusive and one of them just has to go. But the reality, right there in the intersection, is hybrid agility. You apply Kanban thinking, visualization, WIP limits, flow management right within your existing sprint structure. Kanban acts as a seamless, powerful upgrade to whatever environment you're already running. So, the ultimate question isn't which framework is perfectly correct in a textbook. The real question is, will you remain stuck in rigid frameworks, or will you use these data-driven metrics and explicit policies to organically evolve your flow? If you're ready to stop just being busy and start truly flowing, make sure you subscribe to Infinite Business Dynamics. Thanks.
Learning reinforcement.
Modern project management teams are drowning. Despite investing heavily in visual tracking tools, critical tasks remain scattered and deadlines are consistently missed. This creates a major cognitive trap for PMP candidates, assuming that putting a wall of digital tickets or sticky notes on a screen means you are doing Kanban. Visual tracking simply shows what exists. A basic board has columns and cards, but it lacks underlying mechanical rules to dictate when that work moves. This diagram illustrates the distinction. The modern Kanban method functions as a rigorous system to manage knowledge work. On the right, we see the mechanics. A true implementation relies on explicit policies, strict limits on work in progress, and metrics to control flow. Without these rules, a board is just a repository for tasks. Recognizing the difference between a passive visualization tool and an active management system is the absolute prerequisite for passing PMP scenario questions. If a team is using a sophisticated visual task board, why do they still suffer from severe delivery delays and burned-out personnel? This graphic details common symptoms in knowledge work. Notice the lack of visibility. Scattered tasks hide the actual demand, creating a false illusion of health. Moving right, we see high variability. Without flow controls regulating demand, outcomes become completely unpredictable. This unregulated variability leads directly to the deadliest project management symptom, an infinitely expanding backlog of work that has been started but never finished. A board without mechanical flow rules doesn't prevent organizational failure, it merely visualizes it. This diagram outlines the functional anatomy of a Kanban system, mapping the sequence from request to delivery. Notice the explicit policies and class of service indicators. These establish the rules for how a work item is permitted to advance. In a push system, tasks are assigned indiscriminately, forcing massive queues to build up downstream. A pull system operates on capacity. Work only progresses when an actual slot opens up, ensuring the system never chokes on excess demand. Shifting away from pushing tasks onto busy workers and instead pulling value through a regulated workflow is the mechanism that generates predictable delivery. Many project managers operate under a deeply entrenched bias. Every single resource must be operating at 100% capacity at all times. This reveals the WIP limit paradox. Maximizing individual utilization triggers a cascade of context switching and queue growth that stops systemic throughput. This visual proves the point. At 100% utilization, you have a gridlocked highway. The system is completely full, but the actual delivery speed drops to zero. When team members are pushed to maximum capacity with overlapping tasks, they are forced into extreme context switching. That constant shifting of focus exponentially increases error rates and expands hidden queues of waiting work. Now look at the optimized capacity state on the right. By limiting work in progress, you introduce open space into the system. This allows the entire workflow to move at maximum velocity. Mathematically spacing out the work eliminates the friction and the queues that cause project delays. To achieve this, Kanban enforces a strict operational mandate. Teams must stop starting and start finishing. Managing flow means optimizing the speed of the total system. That requires accepting that individual workers will occasionally have idle time. Even in a highly optimized pull system, work will inevitably encounter friction and stop moving. A blocked item is a localized condition affecting a single task.
For example, one specific feature is paused while awaiting a regulatory compliance review. A bottleneck is a systemic capacity restriction. It chokes the total throughput of the entire workflow, causing work to endlessly pile up in one stage while the next sits empty. The management responses differ entirely. Resolving a blocked item means unsticking one task. Resolving a bottleneck requires permanently expanding the capacity of that specific stage. Kanban demands that project managers focus their attention on removing these systemic constraints, rather than micromanaging the daily schedules of their workers. Confusing a temporary, isolated block with a systemic bottleneck will lead you to select the wrong organizational adjustments in PMP scenarios. This chart maps the sequential logic of Kanban. It moves step by step from making work visible to controlling limits, all the way to delivering value predictably. Applying this sequence naturally exposes underlying systemic problems. It brings organizational dysfunction into plain sight. As detailed in the Principles panel here, Kanban handles this dysfunction by dictating that you start with what you do now and agree to pursue evolutionary change. The method actively rejects disruptive, top-down process transformations that immediately alienate entrenched stakeholders. Because it respects existing titles and roles, Kanban is the mathematically superior framework for introducing agility into highly resistant traditional organizations. On the exam, you will encounter scenarios where a team is drowning in multiple concurrent items and missing deadlines. The standard management instinct is to immediately add more personnel. That fails because it simply injects more communication overhead into a broken flow. The correct exam action for an overloaded system is to evaluate and strictly enforce WIP limits. You will also see the transformation trap. Executive management demands an immediate, total overhaul of team workflows. Tearing down existing processes overnight creates massive organizational risk and stalls current delivery. The correct action is to visualize the current state first, then initiate evolutionary change. Do not fall for the Agile framework trap. Kanban is not a mutually exclusive replacement for Scrum. Because Kanban lacks prescribed roles, its flow mechanics can be seamlessly hybridized into existing Scrum sprints. This flow illustrates the baseline for every correct adaptive exam answer, value moving smoothly from backlog to delivery. Success on the PMP exam requires applying Kanban's flow mechanics to specific situational constraints, moving beyond the simple recall of vocabulary terms.
That's it for video 1. You now have the foundations, principles, and essential Kanban terminology. If this helped, like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for the rest of the series. See you in the next video.